Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Anthony's whole life carried on in a straight line without distraction from its main direction. It was one of those rare occasions when a person's fate is sort of preordained before he takes his first breath. Anthony's great-grandfather was a famous surgeon. Grandfather, though not without difficulty, turned out to be the son of an enemy of the people, still managed to continue his father's work. Anthony's father was the head of the entire medical academy by the age of 30. The path for Anthony was paved and equipped with everything he needed as soon as he learned to walk. And he became the fourth surgeon of his generation, which he never resisted in his soul, mind, or aspirations. One more case that does not often occur, when neither in childhood nor in adolescence, let alone in youth, there is no internal protest and desire to realize his own destiny in any other way. Anthony has never been interested in anything but medicine. Their huge 3-room apartment, with high ceilings and corridors you could ride a bicycle through, was always full of guests whose conversations rarely touched on anything other than the doctor's daily routine. The cabinets were tightly packed with tons of books on anatomy and the physiology of genetics. Skeletons and skulls and bones were everywhere. On the walls hung posters with detailed pictures of human organs, muscles, and the circulatory system. In his father's study, where Anthony was never forbidden to enter, there were even salts, alcohol, military hearts, and kidneys. From his childhood, it seemed to Anthony that nothing else in the world, except medicine, existed. The literature that he had had to study willy-nilly at school until the age of 9 seemed to him to be just a tool for learning to read and to be able to put down on paper his thoughts in the form of coherent sentences. And when even by 8th grade this did not happen, he became disillusioned with school, seeing it as a distraction from his main goal. And his main goal, of course, was to get into medical school for the sake of the required test scores. I had to cram it from A to Z, but this seemed to be a mere convention, devoid of any practical meaning. But why would a medical student, for example, need history to know how stupid his ancestors had been during a plague epidemic? But they were, and so they were, and good riddance to them. Now things are completely different, and the focus should have been on what was available. Parents could not rejoice at the purposefulness and success of their child, not realizing that half of his soul remained empty, and though not consciously, but it needed to be filled. As for any human being with ordinary things, her first crush, her romance and interest in what lies far beyond surgery. After graduating with a medical degree with honors, Anthony immediately went into practice. In addition to excellent knowledge, he had an undeniable talent as a virtuoso. A couple of years later, he was operating on such complex patients, for whom even luminaries with 20 years of experience did not dare. To each such operation, Anthony treated as a pianist to a piece of music. The precision of his movements and flawless technique were combined with his ability to see details that would escape the gaze of other colleagues. Buried deep inside, the creative vein found an outlet in this way, using the instruments that happened to be available. Anthony was predicted a grandiose future and shielded him from everything not related to medicine, fearing it might throw him off by the age of 28. Having managed to train in the most famous clinics in Europe and Israel, Anthony settled down at the academy, still headed by his father, and alternating surgeries with training young surgeons. He sort of settled down, quite satisfied with himself and all that surrounded him. In terms of professional qualities, Anthony was impeccable, never benefited from his father's patronage. He had a stern but fair temperament and was quite aware of the innate nurturing of generations. His talent is not a criterion for evaluating the qualities and skills of his students and partners in the shop. Respect for the latter quite naturally flowed from this approach, though at times mixed with white envy and a desire to be noticed on their part. Slightly more than he should have. Such inflated expectations of his grades at first corrupted Anthony. But soon he learned to ignore the unpleasant feelings, treating the people who sought his attention rather calmly, without encouraging or singling anyone out. He was sure that everyone, if he made enough effort, could make his way into the world of surgery. Emotions were considered a hindrance in this business. What was needed here was iron character, endurance, rational thought, and carefully considered decisions. However, the empty halves of his soul began to take more and more notice with each passing year. At first, it was fleeting outbursts out of the blue, spoiling Veja's mood. Reasons that Anthony could not understand, even in hindsight, when he tried to break them into fragments. Then such outbursts became long stretches, first for an hour, then for a whole day, taking half the night with them. And eventually it got to what felt like an endless week. During these periods, Anthony tried not to operate, for fear of making a mistake that might shake his established authority. He understood that no career is without mistakes, but this understanding did not reassure him. He was different. He had no right to be. And not because he is better than everyone else, but because he is aware of the moments in which such a mistake is possible. He has never been so self-righteous that it blinds him. He had lived a little over a quarter of a century, and he felt almost like an old man for whom it was time to start writing his memoirs. He was angry at himself, but he could never truly understand the reasons for these depressive lapses. So far, however, it was still possible to skillfully conceal the remaining problem from colleagues and parents alike. Everyone understood that anyone, even a master like Anthony, could get tired of the strain he was taking on. His relatives, especially his mother, tried in every way possible to surround him at such moments with special care, without asking too many questions or allowing this care to turn into intrusive attention, and from such delicacy. Anthony was only making things worse. He dreaded that sooner or later the day would come when he would snap and baffle them all by sowing the first seeds of doubt in their minds. He needed someone by his side who understood him more deeply than he did and who could tell him the way out of the dark labyrinth in which he was lost. He needed support, quiet, unnoticeable to outsiders, but able to return his focus to what was important. And such a person was soon found. Jenna, a young 22-year-old nurse, often assisted him at the surgical table. Jenna came to work while still in her third year of medical school from the nursing department, needing 2 years and 10 months of study. At first, she did an internship, and then, after a successful defense of her diploma, she decided to stay here. She was a quiet girl and tried to stay away from the epicenter of events in any company that gathered for any occasion, so that no one at the end of the holiday and would not remember. Was she with them this time or not? Jenna was considered an excellent operating table assistant. Anthony shared this opinion quite well. And every time before the operation, he asked that this girl always be present. So he did. Her was the girl. And everyone knew who he meant. Anthony remembered her name, but for some reason avoided saying it out loud. Unlike Anthony, Jenna could not boast of having among her grandfathers and great-grandfathers people related to medicine in one way or another. Was she the first in her family to choose this profession? It turned out so largely by chance, having passed after graduation from high school the documents at once in 2 universities, medical, nursing department, and in the history department of the university. She successfully passed both exams. She could not make a final choice before she began her studies. So she decided, at least for the first couple of months, to alternate her lectures. One day she attended history courses, and the next day medical ones. The dean's office met her halfway, not preventing such an experiment. But 4 weeks were enough for Jenna to make up her mind. And the reason for that was not the preponderance of interest from the medical side. What attracted Jenna more to Anthony than a 23-year-old practicing teacher or his masculine charm? The girl didn't fully realize. It was more of both at once. In her 3rd year, she already wanted to transfer to surgery in order to eventually get a full higher education. But there were no extra places in the department, and women in surgery were still treated rather cautiously, if not grudgingly. No one told Jenna about it directly, of course, referring to the fact that once she had already floundered between history, medicine, and a second time to experiment with her preferences, no one would allow her. Knock it off, told her the sisters, and they're already think about how to go further. However, after graduation from the institute, she did get a job as an assistant in surgery. She was assigned to Anthony. It was even better for Jenna. Here she was out of the limelight. I mean, she was in her element, and she was able to be close to her idol. And to be honest, with a man she was head over heels in love with. One autumn day, when the trolley was on the pavement outside the windows, the cold rain ripping the last leaves from the trees, Jenna and Anthony were left alone in the residence. The surgery that had been planned for today was postponed until tomorrow, because apathy, anxiety, and uncertainty came over Anthony again. He sat with the window slightly open, into which the icy wind was blowing, and settled down. He smoked his second cigarette in a row. He had become addicted to this habit 3 months ago, thinking it might at least fill the emptiness that had taken hold of him. The emptiness was not remembered. He could no longer give up the habit. For 10 minutes they were silent. Perhaps Anthony did not even notice Jenna's presence in the office, smoking a cigarette and closing the window. He sighed heavily, looked around, and seeing Jenna said, "Why aren't you going home? Did you suddenly decide to be honest? Jenna, what is going on with you?" Anthony trembled slightly and looked at the girl, as he had never looked at her before. It was as if before he had only seen a vague blur of golden hair in front of him. And now, in an instant, it took on a distinct human shape. "What's wrong with me?" he asked. It sounded strange, as if it were not an excuse, not a rhetorical figure of speech that served as a substitute for the phrase, "Leave me alone and don't ask stupid questions." It was as if Anthony really wanted to know what was going on with him. And now Jenna had to answer that question. "You haven't been yourself for the past 3 months." Correctly catching Anthony's impulse, Jenna answered, "Do you know how I feel about you? You and I have known each other for years, since my freshman year. I've never seen you like this before." That's how Anthony looked away and frowned. "So what's wrong? Is there something eating you up inside? And I'm not just saying that figuratively. Anthony, you need to get yourself checked out. When was the last time you had a doctor's examination?" "Come on," Anthony said quietly. "There's nothing wrong with me in that respect. I'm a doctor myself. I would understand if my body started to give up. It's probably just fatigue. You know, I've never been on vacation in my career." "Really, Anthony, you can't do that. I've never felt the need." "Maybe you should. So you need a good rest." "Yes, a rest. I'll certainly take 2 weeks in November and go to the sea." "Have you ever been to the sea?" "Only when I was a child." "How do you like the sea? Is it cold? Would you like to keep me company?" Anthony looked at Jenna again. That she was surprised. "You will come with me." "Anthony," Jenna was confused, not knowing if the man was joking or if he was serious. "Let's go." Anthony grasped at his sudden thought. "Or I'm sorry, of course. I don't even know if you're married or not. The way I see it, you're still a young freshman student. I'm sorry. Silly of me. I'm not married." Jenna blurted out, terrified now that Anthony would turn down his proposal. "And I don't have a boyfriend. But you, Anthony, don't even remember my name. You call it a girl. Who told you I don't remember? Is your name Jenna?" "Yes." Jenna lowered her eyes and felt a blush cover her face. "You, Anthony, make sure you go on vacation. And if you're serious about my company." "I don't mind. I am serious. And if you agree, then we agree in November. What do you say?" The bright sun peeked out from behind the dense, endless clouds, and it covered the white walls of the order with its bronze faces, and Jenna's face, which at that moment was unbelievably beautiful, something deep in his heart, and made for a moment tangible and almost intelligible. But immediately it slipped away too, from the not turning left mind. So he didn't have time. It wasn't any way for Klitsch to comprehend. "Let's go home," he said, "as long as it stopped raining." "Let's go." Jenna agreed and walked out of the office, trembling with all her girlish gut at the impossible thing that had happened to him a minute ago. A whole week, After this conversation, Jenna was afraid that Anthony would refuse his offer, especially since for 7 days he hadn't shown up at the clinic at all. It was said that he was just sick and had taken a sick day. But Jenna understood that the reason for his absence was not some primitive flu, but an increasingly gripping yearning. She couldn't find her place. If she had had Anthony's phone number, she would have called him. If she had known the address where he lived, she would have asked to visit him. But she knew neither the address nor the telephone number. So she was left to suffer and hope that Anthony, when he returned to work, would not pretend that they had not spoken. Fortunately, Anthony kept his word. He called Jenna himself, getting her phone number from someone else. He asked her if she had changed her mind about traveling. And if not, what would she prefer? Bulgaria or Turkey? It was up to you. Anthony was confused. Jenna said, "I'm not an expert on resorts. I have no idea how it is with the weather and the sea in November. And with prices." "About prices, do not worry," reassured her Anthony, "since the offer was made by me. I'll pay for the trip." "Anthony, you don't have to pay anything. I can do it myself." No objection accepted. Anthony interrupted her. "Let me be a gentleman for a little while. Think of it as compensation for calling you that girl." "Are you embarrassing me?" Jenna wouldn't let up. "I just don't know. If you want, you'll have all the excursions and entertainment on you." "That's fine." "All right, fine. But I don't have a passport. So you do the paperwork for now. I'll take care of the tour. I suggest Alanya. It's 23 degrees there in early November, and the sea stays warm until the middle of the month. I have not been there myself, but people I know praise it." "Okay," agreed Jenna. "Let it be Alanya." Jenna did not care where to go at all. If Anthony had offered her the North Pole, she would have said yes to that too. I was not interested in the number of stars of the hotel or the temperature of the water. The important thing was that she would be with the man she loved. A whole week, just the two of us. 10 days ago, she couldn't even dream of that. And now? And by the way, is Anthony going to book separate rooms or one for two? He didn't even ask what Jenna thought about it. Yes? And how would he have asked? That probably wouldn't have been very decent of him. Do you think he would have asked? Would we be better off living in separate rooms or squeezing into one? With separate beds, of course, don't you think? Jenna laughed. But it's silly to ask that, isn't it? And yet she wondered what Anthony would choose. A sweetness pervaded her body. She felt dizzy all night after that call. She could neither eat, nor sleep, nor concentrate on anything. In her mind, she had already seen herself on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, walking along the sandy beach. Next to the handsome Andrew, everyone turned to them and whispered, "God, what a couple. Look, look, they are like gods. They are enveloped in the warm air." The gentle rustle of the waves, echoes of distant music, shouts, seagulls, then kisses, kisses, kisses. Jenna completely lost her head and began counting the days left until November. The flight was scheduled for the 15th. Time passed so slowly that by the end of each night she had no energy left. It was as if she had lived not just one day, but at least a week. She bought a small calendar at a kiosk and began crossing out the days that passed, approaching the saving date. It had been an unusually cold day in mid-autumn in NY on the day they climbed the ramp to the plane. The temperature had dropped as low as 10 degrees. The flight was delayed the entire time, as if evil forces were trying to make sure that Jenna could not escape to her dream. The plane finally took off, and she calmed down so much that she fell into a deep sleep within 5 minutes. The plane landed, as if in another world. Alanya welcomed the guests with a cloudless blue sky and a temperature of +23. As Anthony promised, the room Anthony had ordered was shared, but with separate beds. They did not say a word to each other about it, as if it was a matter of course and did not require any prior arrangement. The room was on the 7th floor and had a balcony from which they could see the beach and a long pier, near which there were bathtubs, small yachts, boats, and jet skis. In the evening, when they rested from the flight and decided to have dinner in the hotel's cozy restaurant, They were in for a surprise. On the 16th of November, it was Anthony's birthday. On the stage, a strange man announced in Russian into the microphone. Anthony only winced at this unexpected attention, but politely got up from the table with his glass in his hand to thank him and clapped his hands loudly to the audience, gathered for dinner in a small room. Jenna was upset, for she was not at all prepared for the event. But Anthony reassured her, saying that he did not like his birthdays and never celebrated them. And still, said Jenna, let me order at least a good wine. Otherwise, I'll feel uncomfortable all night. Okay, smiled Anthony. And stop referring to me as you. And I'm starting to feel like an old man. Done, agreed Jenna. She'd been waiting a long time for Anthony to suggest that, because that stupid you on her part now looked at the very least strange. After all, they were already going to be sleeping in the same room tonight, albeit in different beds. In fact, the status of their relationship had become completely different. She was no longer just Anthony's assistant, but her very own friend, even if for now, without the intimate connotations. This did not last long on its own. The first night, after drinking a fair amount of wine and strolling around the hotel grounds, caught in the bright lights, the music, and the fun of the crowd, they found themselves far from being in separate beds. That evening, Anthony came alive in front of Jenna, almost the same way she had first met him when she first went to college. He talked nonstop, reminiscing about his past and cracking funny jokes. Jenna, I wished that this mood did not evaporate like a fog tomorrow morning, so that their relationship became even closer, opened up entirely new horizons in front of him, and sowed unknown to her, or Anthony, grass. And simply, she longed for physical intimacy with this man. Their night was magical, filled with passion and tenderness. Fast forward and deepen the space to the point of unreality, to shivers all over her body, to oblivion. And the most surprising thing was that in the morning the fog had not dissipated at all. Anthony wasn't about to fall into his usual wistful emptiness. The feast of their feelings lasted for 7 days and nights. They were surrounded by a merry-go-round of impressions, alternating love-passion with beaches, with the Red Tower in a cave and home, with a bunch of other pictures that remained in memory. Only vivid but brief, nameless fragments of this wonderful couple. And then the tale ended as abruptly as it had begun. And that's when Jenna believed in her constancy, and when she stopped expecting any kind of trickery from fate. The change in Anthony's behavior did not happen overnight, of course. His relationship with Jenna unfolded slowly, week after week. So the woman had to celebrate the new year alone. She could not even muster the strength to go to her parents. She said she would celebrate with friends and will come to visit, maybe at Christmas. As the chimes chimed, she sat with a glass of champagne in her hand and wound her tears into it. She didn't understand why things suddenly began to change a week after they returned from the hall. At first, Anthony tried to seem as cheerful as he had been at sea, though Jenna sensed a tension in his cheerfulness. Then he became dry. In conversations, he refused to meet outside the clinic, citing fatigue and poor health. And by the end of December, he stopped talking altogether, not trying to explain his aloofness in any way. Jenna replayed hundreds of times in her memory all the conversations in which she might have offended Anthony unconsciously, but she did not find anything close to that in her words. On the contrary, she always tried to be delicate, perhaps even too delicate. In addition, there was another event that was impossible to ignore. Jenna found herself pregnant a month and a half early, and her belly began to grow. Not so obviously that outsiders noticed it, but a particularly attentive coworker still began to suspect something, especially since it was no secret to anyone their intimacy with Andrew. That was another reason why she didn't want to go to her parents. She would have had to explain the situation somehow. And Jenna didn't fully understand it herself, and it was not difficult for the coworkers to compare the elementary facts that preceded the noticeable changes in Jenna's figure and behavior. So none of the particularly attentive had any doubts about who the father of the unborn child was. No one dared to ask unnecessary questions, neither Jenna nor Anthony. Everyone knew that something wrong was going on between this couple, But no matter what, the situation required a decision about their relationship and about the baby. Anthony and Jenna had no doubt about it. He, too, had noticed the changes in her body and therefore had some thoughts of his own about it. Jenna herself wanted this child, even regardless of whether Anthony would want it. But the prospect of being abandoned by the man she loved really frightened her. How would she cope if she had to be alone? What would she do if Anthony finally turned his back on her? One way or another, she could explain everything to her parents, and they would certainly support her. Of course, she would have to listen to a lot of criticism, a lot of doubts, but in the end she was sure of that. They would get it right, and they would accept the situation as it was. But what about work? If Anthony turned out not to be what she had previously painted him in her imagination, she would not be able to stay with him in the clinic. Maybe her colleagues will even end up on her side. But that's all the more terrifying. She doesn't want anyone's pity, and she doesn't want it to reflect on Andrew, because many will consider him, though not a monster, but a very long man. However, it can also happen that they will consider her a foolish window dresser. Such a state of affairs would not make her feel better either. She would have to quit her job after all. Jenna jerked nervously at the thought. So the champagne glass tipped over on the tablecloth, and its contents spilled over the table, catching the cell phone lying next to it. She still hoped that Anthony would call her, if only to wish her a Merry Christmas. Jenna grabbed the phone and ran into the kitchen to wipe it off with a towel. Tears flowed from her eyes by themselves in large drops, slapping the linoleum. What was she going to do? What to do? The 3 holiday days from the 1st to the 3rd of January completely confused all thoughts and feelings. Every day, Jenna dialed Anthony's number an endless number of times, but he stubbornly didn't pick up. Only on the evening of the 3rd did he finally deign to answer. "Speak," he said, instead of the usual. "Hello." He sounded drunk and annoyed. "We need to meet," Jenna said, trying to keep from sobbing. "I can't drive right now." A little calmer, Anthony said, "If you want, you can come to my place. You know the address right now. Now, take a cab and drive." "Okay." Jenna jumped up from the couch, washed her face, dressed in the first thing at hand called a cab, which drove for half an hour and ran out into the street. They sat in the room, lit only by multicolored milk lights. After all, Anthony was getting ready for New Year's Eve, which meant he wasn't completely out of touch with life. They found themselves at a half-empty table with only a bottle of cognac and a saucer of sliced orange slices. Anthony, disheveled, unshaven, drank from behind that glass and smoked incessantly. "You could smoke less often," Jenna said. "Are you worried about the baby?" "I am." "So you decided to have the baby?" Jenna frowned. Anthony said that last sentence as if he had nothing to do with the baby at all. She wanted to be indignant, to yell at him, to vent all the pain she had accumulated, but she held back. There was no need. Now more than ever, she needed calm and common sense. She had to understand why Anthony was acting like such a bastard, and there was nothing to defend him, nothing to make excuses for. "What's going on with you?" she asked. "Can you explain it to me? I don't understand. It doesn't happen without reason, without a reason. Explain it to me. Maybe I am stupid and do not understand something simple." Andrew's face twisted into a grimace of pain. He looked at Jenna almost hatefully and said, "I don't love you." That was the explanation. "And what does that mean to me?" "Nothing. And it must mean a lot to you. If you suffer and try to understand something, I don't believe you." The woman's head was in her head. "You're not like that. You're not capable of it. What is it to leave you in your position? Stop it. I'm not the first. I won't be the last. It happens all the time. You may have been making something up about me, but I'm not who you think I am." "No," Jenna continued to wonder aloud. "Whoever you think you are out there, that's not who you are. I know something different here. Tell me the truth. What is it?" "No other reason," Anthony concluded, "except the one I told you about, no." I don't love you and I don't. I want you to keep harboring some illusions about me. As for your child, that's up to you. It's yours too. Why would you say that? Get an abortion before it's too late. What? Jenna almost screamed out. It's better for you and for me. Jenna couldn't contain herself any longer. She jumped up from the chair, tried to say something else. But when she couldn't find the words, she just slapped Anthony on the cheek with all her might. He smiled crookedly, finished off the rest of his drink, and then calmly said, "You can find your own way out. I won't see you off. Goodbye, Anthony." Jenna assisted me only once after that conversation. Fortunately, the operation was not so complicated. Otherwise, it could have ended for the patient. Sadly, not because of any discord felt in their established team, but because Anthony was completely out of shape that day. He sweated incessantly before each action and froze, as if trying to remember what to do next. And his hands were shaking. Everyone at the time thought he was severely hungover. Jenna thought so too, tired of wondering what was going on with Andrew. She gave up. All her thoughts were now focused on the child she was carrying under her heart. It was necessary to exclude from her life everything that could interfere with the correct development of the fetus. The maternal instinct took over her undivided, painful in every sense of love. The day after her surgery, she wrote her resignation letter. Her colleagues silently let her go, understanding how hard it was for her to carry two burdens at once and killed Andrew's feelings and hopes for the soon emergence of a new life. None of them wanted to be in her shoes for the entire pregnancy. Jenna went to live with her parents. They were glad to have their daughter in their home, especially her mother. They knew their girl too well to fail to understand that the child-to-be was not a consequence of her insides, not a whim or a desire to prove something to herself or the car that had abandoned her. Despite her rather romantic nature, Jenna has always been a pretty sensible person and knew exactly what she needed in life not to get bogged down by small things. Her family was very well off. They lived in a small village in their own two-story house, with 7 rooms, with a stone hall and a spacious outdoor terrace, where once a week gathered in the evenings. The closest of friends, Jenna's father had been in the military. He retired early and was now in the custom home and communications design business. He had no building or engineering background. At his mother's insistence, he enrolled in a military school, something he regretted many times later. Now, however, he was getting more and more clients because he was designing, as they say, at God's level, in such an environment, surrounded by attention and care. Jenna was waiting for August, the month her son was to be born. The gender was already known for sure. Jenna had time to come up with a name for him. Peter. Peter, it sounded good. She did not hold a grudge against Anthony. In conversations with her parents, she preferred not to touch the subject. Her resentment finally subsided after it reached her. Rumors that Anthony was suffering from very serious health problems. Apparently, this was the reason for his deteriorating character and the rejection of all those who reached out to him in one way or another. He had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and his shaking hands and strange behavior in that last surgery were the result of that very disease, its first visible symptoms, apparently after his return from the colony. Anthony did go for a checkup. That's when the diagnosis was obviously made. And in that case, all his further actions could be easily explained. To hear a practicing surgeon with such a verdict is in 1 second to lose the meaning of his whole life. After all, Anthony couldn't imagine himself without surgery. It was his only passion, the only point of application of all his energies and aspirations. He could probably teach for a long time. After all, Parkinson's at his age is a disease that takes a long time to develop. All the more so if you start therapy in time. But that was not an option for Anthony. Knowing his nature, Jenna understood that he would not make any compromises, but rather would begin to ruin his life, deliberately bringing it closer to the abyss. Many times she thought about calling him so they could meet and talk about everything. But she knew that, least of all, Anthony would want to meet her now. He wouldn't accept pity, much less allow a situation where he would be a burden to anyone for even a minute. Jenna could only silently worry about him and cry endlessly from her own powerlessness to change anything. She even rushed to study all the information available on the internet and in the literature about this insidious disease. On the one hand, the picture looked horrifyingly gorgeous. Actor Robin Williams was driven to suicide by the disease. Salvador Dali lost the ability to paint. Muhammad Ali had to end his career as a boxer in his early 40s. The disease broke seemingly indestructible people. But on the other hand, there were those who gave it a decent fight. Guitarist Donovan Lipton continued to perform and record albums with his band for a long time. Actor Michael J. Fox, who began to drink a lot after the diagnosis, still managed to pull himself together and decided to fight. As a result, he even organized a public foundation for the study of the disease, sponsoring its study. Over time, interested not indifferent people were able to advance the invention of techniques to help keep people with Parkinson's symptoms afloat. In addition, neuroscience did not stand still either. New institutes were opened, new drugs were produced. But you can't narrow all the meaning of your life down to one single point. There is more to the world than just the operating room. The world is enormous and replete with an inconceivable number of interesting things. If you even have 15 years to live, you can spend them in different ways, either by oppressing yourself and your destiny, or by trying to get new experiences and new impressions. You have to break free of your selfish interests. You have to learn to trust people, especially those who sincerely extend their hand. But Anthony had always been stubborn and fixated on himself. And it wasn't so much his illnesses that were ruining him now, but his own character. A way out existed, but Anthony would not even look in his direction. Jenna became so fascinated by the study of the disease that she became interested in the whole of neurology as well. She wanted to retrain and, naturally, get a medical degree as well, but she realized there probably wouldn't be time for that anymore. That's another 6 years, plus residencies. But she would definitely try to move in that direction. In August, the long-awaited Peter was born, a perfectly healthy boy and surprisingly calm. Jenna lived at her parents' house for another year after that. Her mother was happy to finally have a grandchild. Her father, too, was now in a constant state of complacency, though outwardly he tried not to show it. He began to work more, wishing to provide everything the family needed. No one reproached Jenna in a year and a half. No one said a word about the fact that it was time for her to start taking care of herself. In fact, Jenna had no intention of staying with her parents any longer than objective circumstances demanded. As soon as she had free time, she got a job. Her father helped her, and this was one medical school, and we mostly in the military. As is more often the case in the most advanced technology appeared first of all in such places. An operating nurse with so much practice was valued everywhere, and Jenna was happy to be hired. Assisted, she is now a neurosurgeon, without stopping to educate herself. And there were even some plans. Everything was now shaping up in Jenna's life in the best possible way. She continued to think about Andrew, but without the pain she had felt in the first months after the separation. At first, she tried to keep track of him through mutual acquaintances, but then all connections were severed. Some just changed their number. Some quit their previous jobs. Someone has lost the desire to communicate on a topic that is not interesting. Anthony disappeared from Jenna's radar. The last news about him was that he stopped practicing and switched to teaching. But the superiors at the institute where he lectured were unhappy with him because Anthony was often absent from class without a good reason or came to the pulpit drunk. Neither his past merits nor the regalia of his ancestors could help him now. And in the end, he remained beyond even the theoretical part of his profession. What was he doing now? And is he even alive? Jenna had not had the slightest idea for a year now. All the time she had been occupied. Now work, study, and growing up Peter. Their second meeting with Andrew happened 7 years after the separation in a completely random way. Jenna was returning from work, and after getting off the bus 3 stops early, decided to take a break in the city park. Sitting on a bench, watching people walking, listening to the sound of voices. It was the month of July. It had been a week in advance. All the fountains in the park were working. Children were jolly running under a stream of cold water. Weary stuffiness and pigeons were lying in the grass, wings growing on the ground and breathing often. To cool down somehow, Jenna drank from a can of Coke she'd bought from the vending machine in the park. She didn't notice a man walk up to her. He stood a few feet away from her for a minute, either staring at her or trying to find some way to draw attention to himself. Sensing that look, Jenna looked back at him and froze in surprise. She recognized the man at the first second. It was Anthony, only in some shabby clothes, a little up to his neck, and with a beard, ungroomed and wispy with absorbent cotton. His face was black with tan, and his eyes rolled red, either from fatigue or from drinking too much. Even yesterday, Anthony whispered softly to Jenna and started to move from the bench. The man wanted to smile, by all appearances, but it was more like a mixture of regret and apology. He couldn't find the words, so he just nodded affirmatively, as if bowing in a kind of greeting to Jenna. "I didn't recognize you at all," said Jenna. "So much better, at last," Anthony spoke. His voice trembled slightly and sounded for 3 minutes, but you couldn't tell he was joking on his face, not displaying emotion. "It's been so many years since I've seen you. How are you? What do you do now?" Anthony asked me again. "So you're aware of my illness?" "I know. I'm sorry it's come to this." "Well," Anthony shrugged. "Everything in life is relative, isn't it? I'm sure it could have turned out even worse. And right now I'm walking, collecting aluminum cans from behind a can of my own. I came up to you and couldn't believe my eyes. It's the first time we've seen such a bad situation in so many years." Anthony was silent. "How are your parents? Where do you even live now? I've driven by your house several times in the evening, and I haven't seen any lights on in your windows. I haven't lived there for a long time, and there are no lights in the apartment. Not since my mother died. But it's a long story. I wouldn't want to. You know, right? I'm sorry, I didn't know. What about your father? We don't talk to him." Who now? You can see for yourself. But he's alive and well, writing his memoirs." Jenna waited for Anthony to ask how she was doing, what she was doing, and what she was doing with her life. But he, in spite of the occasional pause, he didn't ask any questions. Either he was not interested in knowing, or he was afraid that Jenna would talk about her son. Did Anthony even know that she had given birth after all? She didn't know that either. The conversations drifted away, and already heat was tiresome as it was, and Anthony was clearly in physical discomfort. He kept dropping the bag filled with the collected cans on the ground, then picking it up again, as if to let me know that it was time for him to go. He kept batting his right eye, his hands twitching more and more visibly, shaking in small shivers. "Is there anything I can do to help you?" Jenna asked, realizing what the answer would be. "The can," pronounced Anthony. "When you drink it without throwing it in the trash." Jenna handed him the can she never got, took it from the bench to her purse and sighed heavily. "Bye then." "Yeah," Anthony nodded, taking the can. Goodbye with a heavy heart. Jenna turned around and walked to the bus stop. After about 50 yards, she couldn't help but look around. Anthony was nowhere to be seen. Near the bench on which she was sitting, 2 boys were bustling about, and a flock of pigeons sprang from the grass, noisily flapping their wings. It was as if she were only dreaming. But she hadn't slept. She hadn't slept, had she? Things went south about Anthony's fate right after Jenna quit the clinic. After his return from Alanya, he did lie down for a couple of days for an examination and learned his diagnosis, more passing on the sentence. In the first few days, he still thought about telling Jenna about it. But the further he put off talking, the less he wanted to share his pain. But why should she? How much longer would he live, even with the best of circumstances? 13 or 15 years. Muhammad Ali struggled with Parkinson's for 35 years. But that's what Ali is, to fight. Anthony was never a fighter. He was able to do everything easily without too much stress. And Jenna is young, healthy, full of energy, and deserves a better future for herself. The kind of life she deserves, he now can't give her, no matter how much he wants to. So Anthony decided to distance himself. He wanted to do it carefully, not in 1 hour and not harshly. How did it work out in the end? When he noticed that Jenna was pregnant, then he was completely confused. Now he had only two options, either to stay with Jenna and become an extra burden on her, or to break off the relationship in one fell swoop with no chance of being able to glue it back together. And he chose the second, realizing what a monster he would be to her and to all those who would sooner or later find out about what had happened between them. In principle, he was not used to loneliness. He had never had close friends before. The only person he had ever been close to was Jenna. But before, he had given himself entirely to his work, where he had found his bearings, his meanings, and the content of his life. And when the work is gone, and it won't be any time soon, what would he have to rely on, knowing that every step would now bring him closer to the abyss? Anthony continued to move exclusively in this direction. When Jenna quit his job, he was roused, began to call all the clinics that dealt with neurological and diseases, hoping to get hold of at least one, even the smallest, but still a chance. But no one could give such a chance. The disease was too unexplored, and its entire course depended on 100 nuances, many of which were not directly related to classical medicine. Someone even advised him to start playing table tennis. It was said that it helped many people, and was even better than drug therapy, despite all his natural pessimism. Anthony, still a month and a half, attended a group at the health center, sincerely learning the basics of ping pong. But the disease, clearly it was not progressing. It was certainly not going to give up its position. He began to laugh at himself and preferred tennis to a more familiar bottle. And then he hid his rackets so that he couldn't find them anymore. Nonsense, all nonsense. There was no way out for him. He had to give up and go with the flow to a place where everything would end on its own. And Anthony sailed. As well as the rackets, he abandoned, and the scalpel tremor in his hands no longer went away for a minute. With such motor skills, it was possible to work only in the slaughterhouse. For 6 months, he tried teaching in the department, but soon that too became too difficult. He was beginning to forget. Some of the terms confused elementary concepts, could not logically build their speech in the eyes of students. He began to notice not interest in medicine and self-pity. Now everyone around him knew about his illness. No one spoke to him about it, but as a result it became unbearable to see their heavy and condescending stares. Everyone had already buried him, and he had become a heavy drinker, without counting the days or trying to find a way out. Time flew by, melting and laying on the ground again. Snow flew away and the rooks returned. His parents fussed, trying to convince him that no matter what, it was necessary to fight, that the chance to remain himself, not to break down, always existed. His mother was especially worried about him. He tried his best to be with her, as gently as possible, agreeing to comply with all her requests, at least formally, even for a quotation. And for a couple of months he was not attracted to alcohol. In addition, he began to take some new advanced therapy course, in the success of which my father was particularly confident. And that's when Mom suddenly died. Her poor heart couldn't take it, and Anthony broke down again. He drank and drank and drank. He got to the point where one day he found himself in a hospital ward with 40% body burns. It turned out that she had set a fire in her apartment. So the neighbors barely had time to pull him and his most important documents out of the fire, and the apartment burned to the ground. It was impossible to live there. Anthony moved out of the room to his father, but he couldn't stay with him for more than a month. They had a big fight with him, and Anthony ran away from home in the middle of winter and never came back. Overnight, came to his burned-out apartment, where there was no light, no gas, no water, no heat. And again, instead of making repairs, only sawed while there were still left in the bank account, accumulated over many years of work. The encounter he had had in the park had stirred his soul for a while. Maybe for a week or 10 days, he vividly recalled the events of long ago. The trip to the sea with Jenna, and their passionate nights in the hotel never ceased, and conversations in which naive dreams and harsh reality intervened. How happy he was then. But as usual, he was almost unaware of his happiness at the time. Anthony even allowed himself to be struck by the thought in Jenna. In those days, he found meaning in content more than in his profession. It was unthinkable, but it was a fact. But why was he frightened then? Why did he think it was not worth burdening himself with the fate of this beautiful woman if it were not for the child? No, stop lying to yourself. It wasn't because of Jenna. It wasn't for his unborn child he was worried about at the time either. Pride overtook him, the most trivial of all sins, yet so indivisible he is the great and noble Anthony. How can His Majesty even for a moment allow anyone's compassion in his side also accept someone's sincere support? He would rather die at the back of the universe than accept to be pitied. And what does pity have to do with compassion at all? It's a derivative of love. And what's demeaning about love? God is love, isn't it? So then it turns out that he turned his back on God himself, and he moved on. When he ran out of money, he let some tenants into his apartment who agreed to fix up his burnt-out den at half the rent. He himself started wandering through garbage dumps and parks, so he was homeless from the end of April until November. The therapy was completely abandoned, and the disease began to progress with renewed vigor. He could already barely walk a more or less decent distance. He walked out of mountains as long as an old man charcut and skinny clogs on the cold asphalt. Gradually, he began to forget the names of streets and alleys, the names of acquaintances, and whole episodes from his past. Suddenly, he could find himself on the bank of a river, beginning to be covered in thin ice, or on the roof of an unfamiliar house. What had he been there for? The right guess throbbed a painful point in his mind, and he would run away, trying to latch his gaze on something familiar. What would he want to go on living for? But with each month and each day, there were fewer and fewer familiar things. And one day, it was December 15. He was alone in a completely alien world. Anthony recognized nothing. Even the name of the city where he lived could not remember. Outside there was a frosty -20 in front, and behind him stretched the highway leaning into the horizon, with brown dirt coffins on the sides of the road. And on either side of the road was a clear, endless field with no sign of life. Silence. Heard the sun almost set over the edge, seemingly flat from the ground in the west. The temperature continued to drop rapidly. And wherever he went now, death awaited him everywhere. He felt it with all his being, as if he were looking into her eyes now. Anthony smiled nervously, climbed over the muddy snowdrift, and moved almost without feeling his feet. In the field, he walked with difficulty, dragging his feet until dark. Then he ran out of strength altogether. His body began to fill with heat impossible under such circumstances. Anthony sat down and looked up into the sky, where a star was already beginning to dim, twinkling. What a vast and indivisible all around. His head spun, and a wave of incomprehensible gratitude for all this snow, for the sky, for the stars, for all this cold infinity swept his heart. He cried, tears rolling down his unshaven cheeks, immediately turning into icicles. Anthony fell on his back with his arms outstretched, as if he had dissolved into space, losing his last bearings. Jenna. The encounter in the park with Andrew was unpleasant, and for a month after that day, she found no rest. But how had Anthony brought himself to such a state? Why wasn't there a strong person at his side who could talk sense into him? Asking herself that question, Jenna realized that such a person was herself, and the thought made her feel even worse. She had given up on Anthony of her own free will. Yes, she should have thought of her son first. Yes, Anthony would not accept help from her, but those were just excuses. Very convenient excuses. You can't even make it stick. No one on the outside could reproach her. After all, if she had tried to get through to that man even once a month, maybe the walls he had erected around him would have come tumbling down. It's never about the measure of effort. In their consistency, grass is capable of breaking through the asphalt on Jenna. Is it any weaker than grass? After all, she couldn't have. Convinced herself it didn't make sense, made a deal with her conscience, crossed out love. And what is love for, if not for this? What is its meaning then? To enjoy life when it's already going relatively well. A month after, a reflection and a reproach to herself, Jenna ventured to visit Anthony at his old address, but found strangers there. They were doing repairs. They said the landlord had given them the apartment for 2 years. They don't know where he lives now. The old number was still stored in the cell phone and turned out to be non-existent. Now after work, Jenna wandered through the parks almost every day, looking for a familiar figure among the crowds of strollers, but all in vain. Then she started going to shopping malls and churches. Somehow it turned out that gradually I started going inside churches, praying the image of Christ for Anthony's health, and putting candles. She had never done anything like that before. Suddenly, she felt such a need in herself. Standing in front of the image, it was as if she was beginning to feel a thin thread, connecting her through Christ to Andrew. Maybe it was just an overabundance of feelings and genuine regret, but it certainly was. And so it went on until December. Peter's son went to first grade this fall. He grew up to be a very bright and cheerful child. And looking at him, it was impossible not to see in his features and manner of speaking a copy of Anthony. Jenna did everything to ensure that her son grew up happy, and here she could not reproach herself for anything. His grandparents adored him too. Peter gave Jenna strength and confidence, gave her life meaning, and nothing could overturn it. That same December, another very important event happened. Jenna was asked to head an entire department at the clinic where she continued to work. With the patronage of her father and her superiors, she had managed to enroll in the evening department of the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery 4 years earlier. Graduate medical education was now just around the corner. Jenna happily accepted the offer. But this contrast between the prosperity of her own life and the total fiasco in Anthony's life became the very spoonful of tar in a barrel of sweet honey. Jenna felt betrayed all over again and acutely. Anthony was not going to leave her head or her heart. And on December 18, something happened that turned the situation upside down. And it was like this. Closer to Peter's lunchtime, as she and her mother used to do, since sometime after school he came to her office. The boy liked the atmosphere of the hospital, the white clothes, the peculiar smells, the silence. He liked to make rounds with his mother, liked to observe how the doctors behaved and what they talked about with each other. Being a very sociable and curious child, he quickly made acquaintances with both patients and staff. Daddy's genes must have had their effect, and Jenna had no doubt as to what profession the boy would choose when the question arose. The head doctor and Jenna's colleagues did not object to Peter's presence at the clinic. The boy was doing his homework when Nurse Emily walked into Jenna's office and announced that a new patient had been brought into the room, and it would be nice if Jenna took a look at him herself. The case was rather complicated. The man had been transported to them from City 2, where he'd been caught frostbite 3 days earlier. Apparently, said Emily, Parkinson in a very advanced stage. Jenna shuddered, as if an invisible hand had pushed her in the back. Her heart clenched in her chest with a bad feeling. When she entered the room, her premonitions were justified. In the bunk lay Anthony. He was a raven-haired man. His face, with its cheeks dark under the eyes and ears, was gray and seemed vital. He was asleep. They sedated him. Emily said quietly. He was very nervous, like he was delirious. Kept asking me to find Jenna. I don't know if you know him. Jenna was silent, unable to keep her eyes off of Anthony, and barely able to hear what Emily was saying to her. Jenna spoke a little louder to Emily, which roused her. Do you know him? Yes, that Anthony is very good. The surgeon was once a surgeon. Emily was surprised. Oh my goodness. The man was unlucky. It's okay. It's okay. Jenna nodded. He'll get over it. She said it confidently, as if it were a done deal. And that confidence wasn't just a surge of emotion. There was something else behind it, something few people in the clinic knew yet. And Jenna knew. As recently as a month ago, a new treatment had been introduced for a wide range of neurological diseases, which included Parkinson's disease. That's why Jenna was entrusted with the department, because it was supposed to treat with this new methodology from the reports of other clinics of the institutes, which were the first to start the experimental phase. Very impressive results followed. Not even just impressive, but fantastic. Even the most neglected stages of Parkinson's disease were successfully treated. People who were otherwise already doomed were lifted to their feet, and 90% of their brain functions were restored. This did not yet guarantee a complete recovery. But people who had lost their ability to function could live and even work again. Of course, practical surgery was no longer available to Anthony. In any case, it was not yet possible to restore fine motor skills 100%, but he would be able to teach in it again. Jenna had no qualms about it. Who was accompanying him? She asked. Was it any of his relatives or friends? I think it was his father's father. But that's good, that's good. At that moment, Peter entered the room, stood beside his mother, and looked at the man in the bunk. Anthony flinched slightly and opened his eyes. For a few seconds, he was apparently trying to figure out where he was and what had happened to him. But when his gaze stopped on Jenna, he even brightened his face. Jenna almost whispered, he said, "Did you come?" "I came." Jenna came close to the bed and placed her palm on Anthony's cold hand. "Hello, hello, hello," the man answered. "How are you here?" He glanced again at her figure. "Do you work here?" "Yes." Jenna nodded and smiled. "And it's going to be okay now." "It is, isn't it?" "That I promise you." Anthony smiled faintly, too. His lips trembled. He moved his eyes to Pashka and froze again. "Son," with a pause, he asked. Jenna nodded silently. Anthony looked at her questioningly. "Peter," she added. "Peter," Anthony repeated. A tear rolled from his eyes. Slowly, it slid down the window of his cheek and fell on the pillow. "You rest for now, Anthony," quietly said Jenna. "And tomorrow we'll start putting you on your feet." "Good," agreed the man. "I am very tired." Anthony looked at the boy again, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. "Who is this man?" asked Peter when they returned to the study. "Will you get to know him better soon?" Jenna answered her son. "I hope that you will like him."